point in my life, I had dropped out of high school and two colleges. So I asked on Twitter, because I have approximately 20 times the followers on Twitter as I do on this YouTube channel, what people wanted to see in the next video. And overwhelmingly, people wanted me to talk about the time I lived on a hippie commune. So this is gonna be a nice little story time where I tell you about that time that I moved to a hippie commune. Before we begin, I should remind you that all of the events in this story happened 13 or 14 years ago, and because of that, I will do my best to accurately represent everything, but there's things that are just literally lost to the sands of time. The main social media back then was LiveJournal, which luckily I mostly deleted the posts so you can't see my angsty whiny posts about my high school girlfriends. So let's be transported back in time. The year is 2005. So when I was 18, I took a beat, which is a fancy way of saying I had no idea where my life was going or what direction my life was going or what I wanted to do with my life or really anything. I had moved back to my hometown and I had moved out of my parents' house in my first apartment, which because back then and still now, Cincinnati was extremely affordable. I could actually, on a $7 an hour grocery job, afford to live in an apartment by myself. It wasn't a great neighborhood. I lived across the street from a church, but I also lived across the street from a drug dealer with 2 pit bulls and cars that would circle the block all night long. At this point in my life, I had dropped out of high school and 2 colleges and was really just flailing and trying to figure out what I was gonna do with my life. So I really just spent that year working an absolute ton. I worked for $7 an hour at a grocery store as a customer service person, which really just meant that I supervised hordes of teenagers and walked a lot at work. I had a lot of keys. I also volunteered, but occasionally got tips at a nonprofit coffee shop. I didn't have internet in my apartment because I was super cheap, other than very occasional Wi-Fi that I could steal from my upstairs neighbors if I stood at one place right outside my bathroom in my apartment. So I spent most of my time back then working, and I was just working and trying to save money and really trying to figure out what I was doing with my life. I knew I didn't want to go back to college, but I did a ton of research. I would go to the library and check out like 20 books every week. One of the books that I checked out was this book called The Backdoor Guide to Short-Term Job and Learning Adventures. And the book itself is pretty outdated, but I believe they still have a website, so I'll put it down below. This book was just kind of filled with non-traditional learning or job activities that were all relatively short term. So like from like 1 month to 2 years. And one of the things I found in there was a vegetarian kitchen management intern at an intentional community in rural Oregon. I'd always been kind of interested in Oregon, largely probably because of Chuck Palahniuk and the Suicide Girls. I thought this internship sounded kind of interesting because one of the things I really enjoyed doing in my free time was cooking for Food Not Bombs. So I ended up applying via email for this job. I had a phone interview and I got accepted. And the prospect was a 6-month internship. I really didn't know a lot about what I was going into. I assumed I was only moving to Oregon for 6 months and that I would be back. Spoiler alert, I never moved back to Cincinnati. The internship wouldn't pay anything, but I would get free room and board. So I wouldn't have a lot of expenses because it was in rural Oregon. After 11 months of working this grocery job, I had saved up about $2,000, which at the time was a king's ransom. And I had convinced myself that $2,000 was the amount that I needed to be safe. So I had to set a bunch of things in motion in order to kind of give up my life in Cincinnati. I sold a bunch of my stuff at like a garage sale. I thought I was coming back to Cincinnati, lol. So there were a couple things I stored in my parents' basement. I was extremely lucky. My parents had room to store dishes. They stored some CDs and things like that for me. I gave notice at my job, which felt like a really big deal to me because I had spent so much time at work. But I also knew there wasn't really much of a future at that job. And then the last thing I had to do was that I had to find someone to sublet my apartment. So I was only, I think, 8 months into a 1-year lease, and I was extremely worried about breaking the lease, and because I was still a financial nerd, ending up with a black mark on my credit score. Luckily, the apartment was relatively cheap, and I had other friends in my social circle that were looking for places to stay. So I had a friend take over my apartment and also cat sit my cat for 6 months. That ended up not working out. The cat never really adjusted and ended up moving back in with my parents. I was extremely lucky that my parents were able to take in the cat. It was probably the thing I handled the most poorly because I felt like I didn't have a lot of tools to handle it at 18 from 2,000 miles away. Oh, sirens. Time for a coffee sip. I remember doing some things that feel a little silly. I had bleached and dyed hair at the time, and I was like, oh, I won't have access when I live in the hippie commune to things to dye my hair, which was very funny when I moved there because a ton of people had pink hair. So I ended up dyeing my hair back to my natural black color so that I wouldn't have to deal with like maintenance or anything. I actually ended up moving out there with the person I was seeing at the time, who I'm not going to really talk about because the decision to move out was mine and they largely followed me and they haven't consented to be in this video. I found an $87 flight from Indianapolis, which was a nearby airport, all the way to Portland. Oregon seemed like this bizarre liberal utopia when I first moved here, especially as someone who had spent most of their time growing up in Kentucky and Ohio and had been seen as very like radical or liberal there. But when I moved to Oregon, I realized just how like normal I was for a liberal. One thing that really struck me when I first moved to Oregon was that coming from Cincinnati, which is a 50% black city, was just how white it was. My very first day arriving in Oregon, I was like, where are all the black people? That was even more true when I moved to the Hippie Commune, which is actually an intentional community. I used Hippie Commune in the title of this, but one thing I learned and became kind of a geek about is it was technically not a hippie commune. Commune actually refers to when all of the finances are shared in an intentional community, and this community was not structured that way. They had full members who would put some financial investment into living there. They also had renters who were not full members and just paid rent to live there. And then they had people like me that were interns. The way that this organization operated is that they had a nonprofit, a 501c3 nonprofit that ran and employed a bunch of people that lived there. And all the full members that lived there got paid minimum wage and then additional amounts if they had children. The nonprofit there sustained itself not as a farm, although they did grow some food. They largely sustained themselves as kind of a conference center or retreat center for having things like board retreats or yoga retreats. And so the bread and butter of what they did had less to do with farming, which is kind of what I thought when I moved there, and actually had far more to do with event production. When I first moved to Oregon, it was very much still rainy season. Most of the interns at this commune lived in tents during the summer, but because I was there still during the rainy season, it was a little early for everyday tent camping. And when I first moved there, they put me up in a broken down RV that someone had gotten from Goodwill. It actually was a really awesome place to live, and I felt like I had really excellent housing. Very little of it like worked, but it was a lot nicer than living in a tent. The idea was that when the summer came, I would move out to kind of the tent field with all of the other interns, but that never actually came to pass because they never needed to use the RV. Permanent residents on the commune lived in a variety of different housing situations, most of which were either yurts or this triplex. There was also dorm facilities, but those were set up for guests that came that provided income for the commune. Well, that was some time travel for you. If you're wondering why I look more bedraggled and not as good, that's because my camera battery died and I had to wait until it was charged to resume filming this video. So let's pick up where we left off. I moved to the Hippie Commune and I was living in an RV called the Commander. And the idea was that I would move into a tent when the summer hit. In the summer, I actually never ended up moving into the tent, though I did spend a while living in a tree platform with some other people. There were about 40 people there in the off season that were either renters, full members, or interns who lived there doing work on the commune. That could include farming. It could have included maintenance of the 87 acres of the land. And then there were 2 interns that worked in the kitchen and a full-time live-in member of the intentional community who kind of oversaw us. I thought I would learn a lot more about like culinary skills there, and I was already a decent cook, but I learned a lot more about how to manage a kitchen. So when big events came, we would like yoga retreats or something, we would often have a horde of volunteers that we had to manage in the kitchen. And it was a huge industrial kitchen. We had, I think probably total 20 burners or something like that. And, a Vitamix and all of that. And I learned how to delegate tasks and chopping to a bunch of volunteers. It was actually really valuable for that skill set and ended up serving me really well in the rest of my life. One thing I also learned how to do was alter a recipe to be able to serve a bunch of different food needs. So I would have to take the same recipe and figure out how to apply it to gluten-free people, soy-free people, people that are following a raw food diet. We even had someone that said that they would only eat soy if it came from a certain latitude. Something else that was really cool about living there was that I learned how to use a lot of sustainable cooking devices, like hay boxes, which are things that essentially allow you to reduce the amount of water that you're cooking and cover them up, and they'll continue to cook all the way without overcooking. And I learned how to make so much granola. It took almost 4 hours to prepare a batch of granola, and man, do hippies like their granola. In the day-to-day, I would end up doing some cooking, but we would also have shifts. So, we'd have to get up at like 4 a.m. in order to prepare the breakfast when we had a conference center retreat, because it took about 2 or 3 hours to prepare a meal. We also did all of the shifts for when we didn't have a conference happening. All of the different community members had chore shifts where they would come help in the kitchen. And generally, I was always in the kitchen along with the other kitchen staff. But then there was a rotating schedule of people, and we would all generally eat all of our meals together. There was one main phone line that rang into the kitchen, and so if anybody called the commune, it would be routed to the kitchen, and then I'd have to try to find someone. And the ways that you would find people were sometimes you would shout, but obviously you couldn't find everybody there, or you would try calling around to various other locations that had phones and ask them if they had seen someone. So that was kind of a weird part of that job. The most exciting parts of the day at the commune was either my bike ride into town, which was like 5 miles to go check my P.O. box and catch up with Ben, the local postmaster. Occasionally I would go to the video/liquor store, which DVDs, just to be clear, were 100% a thing in 2006. But this was still a VHS only video/liquor store, and they had the most bizarre scheme for pricing. It was $1 for 1 day for 1 movie, or $2 for 2 days for 2 movies, or $3 for 3 days for 3 movies. And they had no logical organization system for the movies, not by title or anything like that. It was just by color of the VHS tape, which meant that if you wanted to find a particular movie and were hoping they had it, one tactic would be before you left, you would go on to Amazon, back when Amazon mostly sold books, and you would look up see if you could find what the VHS cover image was, so that you could see what color it was, so you could try to find it on the shelf. But otherwise, it was just pretty much random. The actual day-to-day life there was, I guess, pretty chill. Like, I worked a lot in the kitchen, and then when the weather was nice, we would go down to the creek or something like that when we had time off. And, sometimes someone who lived in one of the yurts a little farther away would have like a dance party or something. I had a laptop with me and I would have to take it up to the place that had internet, which was like maybe a 15-minute walk from the RV that I lived in. Probably one of the most unique parts about living at this intentional community was that we had an outdoor shower and an outdoor bathtub. And I was a dirty teenager, so I definitely did not take enough showers when I lived there. And I also wore the same clothes for like 4 months. Time there was actually really good. I mostly didn't dwindle my savings that much. I learned a lot about event planning, which ended up carrying over really well to my career. And I also learned a lot about preparing menus and meal plans. I actually ended up moving into a group housing co-op after I left the intentional community. Once I lived there, I realized that once you've lived in any one of these intentional communities, it becomes a lot easier to find your place in other ones. One of the coolest things that happened when I lived there was a gathering of people from all different intentional communities that came in from all across the country, and I got to meet people that lived on intentional communities all over the place. And I got to talk to them about things like how they did healthcare, what the finances of their organization looked like, did they share financial expenses or not with everyone else, makes a successful and unsuccessful community. And I learned a heck of a lot about preparing granola. I think a lot of the things that were hard about it had nothing to do with it being a commune. A lot of the things that were hard about it were the hard parts about living in relative poverty outside of an urban center. Getting access to things like healthcare and just the amount of time that we had to spend driving to and from the city to get anything done. We weren't even that far out. There are plenty of people who live in rural places in America that have to drive 4 or 5 hours to get to the nearest town. And we were only half an hour on the highway from the nearest town. So a lot of the downsides, being car dependent and access to services, I felt really keenly as someone who'd always grown up in a city. I thought it was a really interesting experience, and I would definitely live in an intentional community again, but I'm not sure I would want to live somewhere quite as rural anymore, simply because access to resources is so challenging. I think there might have been more things that were unique about it that I just didn't notice because I was still relatively young and I didn't know how the world worked. If you end up watching this because you're also considering living on an intentional community, I would really encourage you to do some investigation and see if it makes sense for you. Obviously, it was a lot easier to do it when I was younger and I didn't have a lot of expenses or expectations put on me. That being said, there were plenty of people who moved there when they had kids or debts and managed to make it work. I hope you learned something from this video, or at least got slightly entertained. I'm sorry I'm such a mess. I don't know how to charge my camera appropriately before I film. And I can tell you already this video is gonna go up after my noon Pacific time deadline. So if you wanna start constructing punishments for me in the comments, check it out below. I don't know, maybe you can force me to spend 24 hours in a Target or something. Till next time, don't forget to subscribe. I'm desperate. Please subscribe. And I'll see you soon.